hey Rose, how are you today?
Hey Dana, how are you today?
I'm good, and I happen to know you learned something today, and life is all about continuing to learn and grow. So why don't you lay it on us? What did you learn today?
Well, in preparation for season 2, Dana and I are upgrading our equipment, getting new mics, getting new headsets, trying new tools, because this is a learning journey. And I today learned, Dana, that it's important which side of the mic that you actually speak into, because my previous recordings, I was speaking into the back of the mic versus the front of the mic.
So apparently, one best known method is speak into the front of the mic.
That is true. And I would also like to remind our listeners that I spent 33 years in tech.
Exactly. I could get away with that. Right. 33 years in tech, folks. And if you listen to our first episode, she was speaking into the wrong side of her mic.
Well, and it's not that I didn't understand the acoustics part of it. I just didn't know what the front of the mic was.
Right. Front versus back. How would you know? So, yeah. By the way, and this is pathetic that I'm even saying this because I'm so late to the party, but a good old YouTube video to show you how to use something is really handy. And I can't believe how long it took me to recognize that fact. I do it all the time these days, but for a long, long time, it just never occurred to me. Go watch someone on YouTube show you how to do it.
9 minutes of time on YouTube with a very knowledgeable I'll give him the credit, young man, showed me that I need to be looking at the logo, not having the logo face away from you. So there you go. So that's my embarrassing moment for today.
Right, folks. Let's just say that Rose is role modeling the fact that it's all about personal growth.
All about personal growth. I am a lifelong learner.
Exactly.
And I am not embarrassed to admit when I do something incredibly stupid.
Yes.
But okay. On the flip side, we are so excited to get into the meat of our season this year. As we noted in episode 1, we've pivoted to a interview-centric approach this year. So we bring other voices, more knowledge beyond Dana and I's experience into the pod. And today we are excited to have Tom Christopoul join us. Tom began his career in corporate America with jobs in labor relations at both Pepsi and Nabisco. He also spent time at Cendant in roles from the VP of Personnel to the SVP of HR. He was the Chief Administrative Officer and then had roles as CEO and Chairman of both their marketing and financial services organization. And for those of you that don't know Cendant, they achieved at their height a market cap of about $30 billion and operated an enormous number of brands, including Century 21, Caldwell Banker, Avis, Orbitz, and many, many others, including some hotel chains. And it was at Cendant where Tom developed his passion for real estate investing. And it led to roles as managing director at Guggenheim Partners, managing director and co-founder of 54 Madison Partners, Athos Capital, and he's currently the co-founder at Iviron Capital. Tom brings a tremendous amount of board experience, and he's held independent director roles for a series of public and private companies, including one of my favorites, which is one of my favorite East Coast treats, Rita's Italian Ice. So with that, we'd like to introduce Tom. And look who joins.
And he joins at the absolute perfect moment.
I don't know how I planned that.
Oh, that was damn perfect, brother. I got to tell you, that was really good.
And way to be early and, just be here for it.
Yeah. Dana, it's great to meet you. I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person soon.
Yeah, it's great to meet you too. It really is. And your background is so fascinating. I love that you served so long on the people side, because obviously that's my background. Just really excited for today.
I can't be more excited than to have Tom Christopoul with us today. As I mentioned in the introduction, he has an incredible background in terms of size of corporations, experiences, markets, you name it. So let's kick off these questions, Tom, if you don't mind just diving right into it.
I don't.
Okay, across these breadth of experiences, whether it's Pepsi, Nabisco, Cendant, real estate investment firms, are there any common approaches to leadership that you used across these different roles? And is there anything that you changed and pivoted based on size of organization or market, et cetera?
It really has been core across lots of different, not just functions, but also, interestingly, I think geographies, including international geographies, right? And that's what you hear from most people. And it's this foundational element of communication, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But we have kind of over the course of years and decades internalized this principle of there being no such thing as over communication, which is to say that you can never really put to rest any question that you have about full alignment amongst and between individuals, executives, departments, working teams, and at the same time, you can never put to rest the expectation that people can and should be encouraged, if not obligated, to continue to be intellectually curious about what they're doing, about how it fits into what the organization or firm or enterprise is trying to accomplish, and what the roles are respectively for those teams and those individuals. And so we always say there's no such thing as over communication. It can never be assumed. If it turns out that we're talking about something that everybody has already heard or is already aligned about, then it's very easy to just move on, and everyone can acknowledge it. So we talk about that. We kind of create our cadences around communication for very frequent, in fact, frequent shorter updates we find, or I found over the course of time, very, very valuable. I think a thing about that gets overlooked is just the process of a quick exchange of ideas, or an informal question around alignment, or does anybody have any questions, or is anything unclear? Just the process of doing that aligns thinking and aligns behavior, irrespective of whether there's perfect alignment at the end of that discussion or not. The process of communicating, the process of thoughtfully engaging, obviously requires more than a one-way interaction. And therefore, the process itself is what we call self-regulating. It's self-aligning. So being able to do it and creating the expectation that you're never done doing it, but also not making it burdensome. So therefore, like we say, no such thing as over communication, but the equivalent principle is don't let us repeat ourselves, right? Keeps you kind of in a circumstance where the cadence of that alignment just is a continuous process that you never expect to be finished. It's pretty important to always, let's call it, be fundamental.
Yeah, I want to double click on that a little bit. And I want to test something you said, because I was with you about 85% of the time, and I just want to double check the 15%. So I found, and I just gave this example on a podcast that I was on a couple weeks ago, that when I had a big organization, and maybe there's a subtlety here, when I had a big organization, very global, 2,000 people, and we would use webcasts as a tool then, because I can't get to 2,000 people every month, right? So we do this monthly, short form, quarterly, longer form. And I would put the strategy, so like the cornerstone of what we were trying to achieve, in front of that organization at least quarterly. And every time I would ask the question, okay, who here hasn't heard the strategy? We'd get a small population that was either new or wasn't paying attention. Maybe they were busy, didn't make the last webcast, whatever, but a small population would say, hey, I hadn't heard it before. Do you find that there are messages, and this is the 15% I'm trying to qualify, did you find that there's messages that you repeated frequently because they were critical to the success of the organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that what I'm referring to is the process.
Yeah. Okay.
The messaging. There's a whole. I could give you, I guess, a different answer on messaging, which involves a lot of not just clarity and repetition, but I would even say rigidity in messaging. And rigidity in messaging at the right level of granularity is critical, right? So mission is something that shouldn't change. It's something that not only shouldn't change, it's something that requires some level of engagement to understand. And so even though we would describe it as rigid and kind of one way, this is the mission, you have a role in it, and you have an obligation to understand what that mission is and how to interact with it, right? You don't, it's very consistent, and it's not subject to change. What is incredibly, so I would call it flexible, right? And very dynamic across a group, a working team, a function, a geography, is of course what the role is in the execution of that mission. And so, the more you think about the how, right, or even the why, it requires more what I would call interaction, but repetitive interaction, because that questioning and that alignment that I was referring to earlier is obviously an active and engaged activity. The mission that you're articulating has to be pretty consistent, or we used to call it, strategically rigid and tactically flexible, right? And that's that's been developed in the military over thousands of years. It's some people call it traditional. I would say that it is in fact traditional, but part of the reason that it's traditional is it has worked over the course of centuries, right? In circumstances where the stakes are very much life and death. So, it's not like it's a trivial payoff to be, more right than wrong, but you can apply that level of, let's call it, distinction, I think, and understand that if you're not particularly clear, and you're not particularly rigid, and you're not particularly repetitive around key elements of mission, you're not going to have great alignment down the line, because there's no bedrock, there's no fundamental, let's call it, foundation on which we can compare and contrast our strategies against to see if we're lining up with it or not.
Yeah, I think Dana, we just got our first hot take there. That was brilliant, Tom. Thank you.
Yeah, and I heard in that this nugget that applies to just tactical everyday, which is pause and ask for questions. Pause to check for alignment. And I think we can all be just flying along with so much to do, and it's easy to skip over that and make assumptions. And like you said, there's value, even if you're 99% sure everybody is aligned, there's value in that pause.
Very much so. Yeah. No, and that's, we'll talk, I know, a little bit later in the podcast about elements of leadership that are enduring, or that you feel are, can be or should be enduring over different, circumstances and periods of time. And this construct of knowing when to accelerate certain activity and when to hold it back, and when to be more thoughtful and when to be less reactive, is that element of leadership that is much more of an art than a science. We've all been through it. I've read a lot of books. I'm sure you guys have read a lot of books on this. It's not a formula. It's not a formula that's very easily adaptable. So yeah, this construct of alignment, as long as humans are around on the planet, there's going to need to be work done, whether you're talking about, an organization, a political party, a bake sale, a car wash.
I love it.
The PTA, that. So that's a nice, actually, segue to our next question, which is that, speaking of a formula, very, very often, and my background is management and leadership development, I often hear, leadership is so much more celebrated than management. And it's almost said as a formula, a deeply flawed formula. You don't want to be a manager, you want to be a leader. And I think because you've listened to the pod, our point of view is very different from that, which is that, regardless of what your role is, whether it's CEO or whether it's a frontline supervisor with a staff of 7, management and leadership mindsets are important. The mix might vary. But so give us your take on that.
Yeah, I have listened, and this is a really important topic, because people treat them as distinct constructs. And of course, much of the constructs, not just in literature, but in practice, in the business literature, reflect that. but they're not at one point in time different things. And I also happen to think that the idea that certainly seems to have been generated, and I reflect on my corporate experiences, that leadership is aspirational and management is sort of secondary, maybe as a way to describe it, or I think is wrong, because although leadership is an aspirational construct, management and the processes and decision making around management is foundational, right? And of course, in the classic literature, everybody understands that management goals arise from organizational processes and outcomes and circumstances, and leadership generally is a higher level of let's call it perspective, where other elements beyond the organization contribute to questions around what leadership is required. Circumstances in the business environment, competition, regulation, macroeconomic elements. So there may be a difference in perspective that's offered, but of course, any leader, at least that I've respected and tried to learn something from, or have been able to learn something from, absolutely is operating from a foundational component of managerial competence. I just haven't found an exception. I haven't found an exception where a really, really talented and effective leader is divorced from or disconnected in any way from the elements of the management of the business. And what makes a good leader is being able to be competent in those elements across different, let's call it constructs. So, really good leaders of enterprises know a thing or two about IT and process management. They know a thing or two about human resource management. They know a thing or two about sales compensation and sales training. They know a thing or two about all those elements of in a tech firm. They know something about what the engineering team is focused on and how they're focusing on answering the questions that they're resolving. They may not be called on to have obviously deep subject matter expertise in any of those areas, but getting away from or being disconnected from, or even worse, minimizing, right, or diminishing the elements of management that are core to the business, in my mind, is sort of like you're not just throwing out the business. You're sort of intentionally undermining the way the business operates. And I'm not saying that leaders, are nefarious people that try to undermine. I think that this idea that we're just going to celebrate what incredibly, great leadership looks like, yeah, sometimes really undermines. And there's plenty of examples I think we've all worked through where there may be this happens not often, but at times I've seen it happen in founder-led organizations, right? Particularly where a founder is a very gregarious, and some people sometimes describe those leaders as cult-like leaders. They're incredibly compelling in identifying a vision, and they're very emotional in how they construct things. And then ultimately, their organization at times, if they get disconnected from how it's supposed to work, some people describe those organizations as, they're disorganized, right? Or they're not connected. And the vision doesn't match the execution. And that's, of course, when we all know when organizations get into frequent trouble.
99% of the time, I've never seen it that people are purposely trying to undermine management. But again, there are all these messages out there that leadership's what's important and et cetera. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's also, I think it's underinvested in, by the way. I think the best example is one that we have all experienced, either through doing it ourselves or observing it positively and negatively, right? I learned this in my first job, which was more industrial in its orientation, right? To an individual, and particularly to an individual in an industrial position, say on a plant floor, a forklift operator, make up whatever position you'd like, the group supervisor, the team supervisor, the team leader, whatever terminology you might employ, pretty much is the definition of the organization to that contributor. And so all of the things that management may be thinking about in terms of investment and return on investment, those exist. But outside of the world of that supervisor, very little of it matters in a meaningful way to the individual contributor or the team contributor. And so if it's true, which I think it is, that every manager or supervisor and the relationship that they have with the people that report to them and rely on them, right, as their boss, right, which we all have, I think it's almost trivial, like, oh, okay, well, Mary or Bob or Gene or Taylor are new in their job and they'll figure out how to they'll figure out management over time, et cetera, so on and so forth. Well, that's kind of a risky experiment, in my opinion, to do without having at least some fundamental understanding that, managing people is not just something you pick up necessarily. Although that's the way most organizations treat it, in my experience.
Well, I have to give a shout out to my former employer on this one. And Dana, you were there at one point. You saw it. I thought like Intel did a really good job of acknowledging the progression through the different leadership positions. And it was from a direct leadership position, or management position, we would go away for a week and you'd learn some basic skills on how to measure and motivate, right? As a first line manager. And then they did the same for leadership. And by the way, there were also opportunities to learn how to lead through influence, which I think is kind of the common foundational element that if you nail the influence brick, you can build a pretty strong building on top of that foundation. So, one of the reasons we're doing this pod is for people that maybe are in organizations that don't get that level of support, and they can get a couple little nuggets, facts, hot takes through this dialogue of, hey, your role, and Tom, you and I saw it a couple weeks ago. You're on a factory floor, and the person that's taking you through this tour, passionate about their role, engaging the people as they walk through the facility. The indicators are clear for everyone to see. The celebration and the recognition, and as a shout out to Tom, even in his role as an independent director in the board of directors, he is recognizing the organizations that he works with. All of that is really prevalent. And you took there's two lenses in that example. You had the factory floor manager who was doing it every day, real time. And then you have Tom from a board of directors position that is asking the probing questions, celebrating the successes, engaging in the dialogue. And I think that's the element that makes for a really strong organization is nailing both of them, to your point.
Yeah. And it's interesting. And Tom, you'll probably appreciate this, is I basically grew up at Intel, was aware of this, deep emphasis on management training. And then eventually I was delivering it. And then I leave, and I left Intel by my early 30s, right? And I have now traversed a bunch of different industries, and the vast majority, Rose, and you've heard me say this, do not get any of that. Do not get any of the training that an organization like Intel provided. And so I had to learn very quickly to stop referring to different kinds of management practices as basic or 101.
Because maybe they're not.
And also, if you're talking to someone who's been in the game for 25 years, they're not going to be interested in taking a 101 because they don't feel they are at that level. And yet they've never received any management training, and so you have to really do that dance and recognize that certainly the vast majority of people in the professional world have not received any type of kind of thorough management training, and they're just left to figure it out.
No, and I think what's worse about it is over time they assume they don't need it. And look, I think again we've all seen this. I make a big deal out of, and certainly when I was in a CEO role, a very big deal out of what I would call quality of supervision. I mean, I know it's a traditional way to look at the world, but you ever go through your life, which you will professionally, and you'll end up with a couple of bosses who are just assholes, right? And
or incompetent, even if they're nice, they're just incompetent. Okay.
And so you just have to reflect on that experience. And look, sometimes it's fit, and other times there's other things that contribute to that, including things outside of work that are personal and challenging. There's a million reasons why that might be the case. But irrespective of the cause or the circumstances that give rise to it, we've all been in that experience, and we all know the thing that we think about when we are in there almost all the time is how to get out of it. Right? What we're not thinking about is how grooved we are with our position, what kind of contribution we're making, how open-minded we are, how we might be thinking about improving the processes or the contribution that our team makes. None of that really gets the headline. What gets the headline is, I've got all this anxiety, I've got all this, sort of negative energy, and I got no place to put it. Maybe there's an opportunity to talk to do a 1+1 if you're an involved organization, or some 360 feedback if you were at PepsiCo in the 90s. Those types of things, which you, as you pointed out, I might consider fundamental, like very basic, remedial almost. If that doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist for a period of time, that individual who may be doing themselves a big disservice by, let's call it exhibiting the leadership or supervision style that they are, it's a harder hill to climb every day,
and it's a very hard sell to ask folks, or to ask a leadership team to make time and invest in it if they have gotten a certain sort of length in their career, because they're going to say, well, I mean, look at me, I've been plenty successful, and so therein lies the rub, because you basically sort of end up saying, sure, you have gotten results. Are they the optimal results you could have achieved?
And are they scalable?
Yeah. And do you want to know, this is so random, but I'm going to give you an example from something Marky Mark said. Mark Wahlberg. I know. I'm gonna make it work. But it was interesting. He's an interesting guy if you look at his evolution.
Oh, he's an interesting cat for sure.
What he evolved from.
I've met Mark a couple times.
Okay. All right. Well, so you'll have to tell him I brought this up.
He's even more interesting in person.
Yeah. Well, and I'm from Boston, so there's a whole that's a whole thing too.
But she's fangirling a little bit. Let's just say it.
And I saw it was 60 Minutes or one of those did a profile on him, and he said, the question was. He might have been saying how he was excited for his kids to go to college and this and that. And they're like, well, aren't you a great example of why you don't need to go to college? Like, you didn't go to college and look how successful you are. And I will never forget his response, which I just was so freaking solid, which he was like, no, I don't think about it that way at all. I just think about, if I had gone to college, what else would I have achieved by now? And I was like, right? Because that is always the dilemma. Like, when someone has had a certain amount of success without doing something, how do you make the case that it would be worth? Now, obviously, I'm not saying he should go to college and get his degree, but he does make the point, and that's what I'm always like, I'm trying to, and you can't try that hard. You can't make a horse, you can lead the horse to water.
Also, it's really hard to prove a negative, right? Like, you could have done so much better if you had done this or that. If the person is convinced that they're on the right track, it's going to be a difficult conversation to begin with. But I guess my point is, even individuals like that we're talking about, who are the topic, right, have had circumstances where they've reported to people that have made them feel similarly. And so it's a universal experience, but we sort of don't treat it that way. We sort of treat it like, it'll sort itself out. I don't know, at least in terms of what could be more important than a fundamental, useful, flexible set of skills managing people.
Dana, what did you think about our interview with Tom? I loved it.
I loved it. And I'd never met him. And now I'm really glad I have, because I just, totally dug his point of view.
So why don't we hit some hot takes? You want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
I will go first. And he said all kinds of things. But, one thing he said that could not be more true is that to most employees, the embodiment of the company is their supervisor. And, he then made this link, and it's very true. I know that. I've heard that a million times. And he made this point about how underinvested building management skill is in most organizations. And yet those people are the ones that define the company for most staff. And he said, I can't imagine, I'm paraphrasing, but he can't imagine a better investment than sort of helping your people learn to manage other people effectively. And, amen to that.
Yeah, I liked just when we talked about some of like the best known methods that transfer across companies, geographies, size of companies, et cetera, was the foundational skill set of communication. There's no such thing as over communicating. You can't ever assume that you're done. You can't put to rest the concept of full alignment. How your narrative and your messaging requires clarity and rigidity, especially around your strategy. And then you may have flexibility around the execution. And having said that, it really reinforced a lot of the messages that came across in the Art of Communication episode that we did with Tara Smith in season 1. So I'd suggest you go back and get some tips if you're interested in improving your communication skills. And then I loved when he noted that, I think this is an exact quote, every strong leader is operating from a foundational component of managerial competence. I haven't found an exception.
Yes. And okay, not to sort of beat this drum again, but Sam Bankman-Fried was that it all came out during that trial last year, exactly what was going on there. And you've never seen a more extreme example of someone who was very much focused on leadership and completely ignoring the foundations of management that a successful enterprise requires.
Yeah. So thank you again to Tom. Excellent episode. And we look forward to speaking with you and talking with you and having you listen to the pod and our next segment with Tom Christopoul.
And I'll just give a shout out to Marky Mark if he's listening. So thanks. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.